on the 6th floor, if you know what I mean. And so, you know, I found out about that one, and I went up, and I was looking for the collie still. I'm looking for the collie, the blacks. And she gave me a list of books to look for. When Rocks Cry Out goes into the story, it lets you know what that conversation was about, the secrecy of it. And then I went looking for the books, and my time was running out. But I went to the section where the books should have been. They were checked out or gone, and I grabbed the one book that was still left there, and it was the 5 letters that Hernando Cortez had written back to Spain. Now, Hernando Cortez is this Spaniard who came over and was at Cuba and decided he was going to jump the gun and come in and invade the Americas, going to invade the Aztecs. And so he was the one that led the invasion of the black nation that was there that we now call Aztec. But he was writing what he saw. These were not really letters. They were narratives of what he saw and what was going on and what they were doing as well. But he was writing about the mosque that he saw. He was writing about the barber shops that he saw, how fine these barbers were. And he was talking about the Moorish dress that they wore. The clothing was Moorish, and the buildings were Moorish in architecture. And when he crossed on the top of the mountain to invade the land, to come down to this capital of the Aztecs, he was at the top of the mountain. He looked down and he made this strange remark. He says, "And there lies far-flung Venus." That doesn't mean very much to many people, but it meant a lot to me. I was familiar with Venus over on that side of the ocean and that city sitting on that water, and I knew what he was saying. Here was a city built on canals with ships all around it, and it's this African city there with the Moorish architecture built on the design of a Venus. And later I understood that's exactly what it was. He started describing the city. Here's this marvelous African city sitting on a man-made island in a man-made sea where Mexico City stands right now. And you've got this black man. If you've ever seen this piece of art called the Moorish Chief, I'm going to tell you right now, they said they don't know who that man is modeled after. But when you understand the descriptions of Montezuma, this African that they call Montezuma, you will see that Moorish chief and you will be looking exactly at Montezuma. He is fitting every description that they gave, and then he has this little secret thing about it. When you look on his head, you see he's got this white cowl on his head, and underneath that white cowl is a little small red cap. Now, they'll try to say that's about the assassins or the assassins. No, you got to understand, Mexico is Lower Egypt. That's where Memphis was, and when you're the king of Memphis, your crown is red. And I'm thinking they're trying to show him secretly that this is Montezuma. They said Montezuma is this medium-built man, and they talked about the beard that he has that's shaped, and they're talking about he's black, and then others said very dark-complected. And I'm looking at the Moorish chief, and I'm not seeing anything that does not agree with the descriptions that they give of Montezuma. And I'm saying, well, now we got a problem. Aztecs are Indians. That's what I was told. But now I've got Martha Malaku's education under my belt, and in the book of Ivan Van Sertima, he talks about those 2 expeditions, those 2 voyages of ships that came out of Senegambia. He's talking about those 500 ships and those 2,000 ships that went across in 1306 and again in 1311 looking for the first group of ships, or about those years. Now, we have those ships coming across the Atlantic from West Africa, and then they say there is no record of what happened to them, except now I'm in the Americas. I'm at Mexico. I'm looking in the records that the friars put together when they talked to these Africans there whose histories were being destroyed as soon as they took over that land. They were just burning them in the street, piling up the books. and yet here is this friar, here's this Bernardino Sahagún who's come in and he's earned their trust, and they said, well, we got a couple of books they didn't get, and so he's recreating the histories that Spain and the church thought they had destroyed, and so he's rewriting them all over again, and he's showing these Aztecs as blacks with African features. And now it gets a little better, because he's also talking about the conversation that Montezuma had with Cortez. And now here is Cortez also putting in his journal the conversation he had with Montezuma. And here's Castillo. He's putting in the conversation that Cortez had with Montezuma. And here are these other writers, and they're putting in this conversation that Montezuma is having with Cortez. And I thought it was unbelievable that Montezuma is sitting right there, this black African in this Moorish clothing with this little red cap on, because he's really the king of Memphis. And he's sitting there and he says, well, you know, my father and my grandfathers say that we are not of this land. He said very clearly to Cortez, we are strangers here. We come across that sea in ships, and we landed at the city of Panuco, right south of Texas, and we came in, and people really didn't want to have much to do with us, but we found out how to work politics, and we started making some alliances, and before they knew it, we had become the most powerful group, and now we are the powerful group, and then we came and we found this island and built our capital on it in 1325 A.D. Now, we have 500 ships and then 2,000 ships leaving out of West Africa. In 1306, 1311, they're crossing the Atlantic. Nobody knows what happened to them. And here the Aztecs are saying, and we arrived about that same time in our ships coming from over there where the sun rises. And we came in, and now they're being painted in their books as blacks, as Africans. And so the white scholars who then got control started explaining things, and they started saying things like, well, you know, when they came in, they started looking for the symbol of a cactus with an eagle standing on the cactus clutching a serpent in its claw. I wish I could tell you what that really was, but that's not the truth. These Africans already knew that other Africans had built cities in the Americas. That's why they were coming over here. And now they were looking for that other West African nation called Memphis. And the symbol of Memphis was because Upper Egypt, the eagle, had defeated the Lower Egypt, which was the symbol of the serpent, and Dan was the serpent, like the Dan people in West Africa. And so the symbol of the United Kingdom was this serpent being held in the claw of this eagle. And they knew at Memphis that symbol would be there. And when they found that island with those columns broke down and with these symbols of Egypt on it, they knew where they were. And they started rebuilding Memphis, the capital city that they now call Tenochtitlan. The Aztec capital actually is an African capital built on the top of ancient Memphis, the other West African capital that was built there in Mexico. So here we go. So now we have the understanding that Martha Malaku had given me from Ivan Van Sertima's book about these ships coming over. Now we've got Hernan Cortez's letters talking about the conversation with Montezuma, saying, and we arrived in these ships, not across the Pacific from the Orient, as so many professors try to tell you now. He said we came across that one, where the sun rises. We came from that direction and came over. Well, Asia's not over there. Africa is over there. So now we have these Africans coming in. Now here's the deal. Hernando Cortez stops by the Yucatan Peninsula before he comes in, and he picks up a woman to help translate so he can know the secret language and know what they're going to do, and she's going to interpret it for him. Poor sister tore up the African nations with what she did, but she did it for a reason. They had expelled her from this city some years before, took her from grace, disgraced her, and now she wanted revenge. And so they recruited her, and she came in, and she was telling them everything they were saying secretly that they thought Cortez and these Spaniards could not understand. But they kept calling this woman Marina. But really, they were also calling her Malinche. And it wasn't until I got another piece of understanding that was coming out of West Africa that says when you talk about Mandinka, the Fulani called them Malinche. They were calling this woman Mandinka the entire time. Malinche. Malinche, what they say. Malinche, do this. She's a Mandinka. She has come from Mexico City, where these other Africans were building their capital city on that island. So now we have Fulani in the area, we have Mandinka in the area, we have the book showing them as blacks and with African features. We have Montezuma saying we arrived in ships coming from across the Atlantic, and we came in the 1300s and built this capital in 1325, just a few years after those ships left out of West Africa. Oh, we have Africans now. And then it got very, very nice when I found these forbidden histories that they wrote, that the Bernardino Sahagún put back together, that they had destroyed, and then it confiscated these records and kept them in a monastery for about 300 years, hid them, and finally they came back out. But he had recreated the histories of the Americas. And here this friar was writing what these Africans were telling him about the history, and they said, well, you have to understand that even the old Mex, when they came over, you know, they came with this pharaoh, and they call him Naharka, but we know Taharka's name when we hear it, even if they change the T to an N. There's Naharka is Taharka, and he's dead, and he's coming to be buried in this area. But they said that the man that's leading this expedition is the African whose name is Meshi, M-E-C-I. And now we have the meaning of Mexico, because they were first called after this African, the land of Meshi, and the land of is, of course, Ko and Ka and Ta and those kinds of terms. And so Mexico, Meshi's land became Mexico, and now we say Mexico. It's named after that African, Meshi. And there it was in the records that this friar, Bernardino Sahagún, had assembled. That's why they were called the Forbidden Histories. Blacks were never to know these again. So now we're in Mexico. We have that part. But then the Aztecs say, but all these pyramids there in the nearby great city, right here beside us, we don't know who built those, and I want to know who they were. Well, I've got the West Africans in, but now we've got some pyramids that's looking a lot like Egypt. So I went and asked Egypt. I started checking their records to ask them, do y'all know anything about the Americas? Have you written anything? I mean, if you build a city like Heliopolis in the Americas, I figure you're going to write about it. And they did. And I saw so much in those records. One of the first things I saw were the writings that said, you know what, and we would go to this great pyramid, and we would ascend the double staircase and receive our crown as pharaoh. Well, the Great Pyramid on the Nile in Northeast Africa doesn't have stair steps going up it. It doesn't have temples on top of its summits. They could not go and break through the boat on the temples atop those great pyramids. There are none there. And that was the clue that Egypt was writing about the Americas. And the deeper I got into the records, the clearer it got. They started actually saying, and because Amun loved that land so much, he said it's his beloved land, and that word was Mary, the beloved, Mary, M-E-R-I, Mary. And the land, of course, as before, is Ta. So you have the land, the beloved land, Ta Mary. And they kept that name and just put the Ta on the end of it. So Ta Mary became a Mary Ta. We simply say America. We kept the name that Egypt gave to the Americas. So that was the big mystery behind that $10 million map that Martin Waldseemüller made and then put the name America on it in 1507. And then those who knew and those who were trying to hide things said, wait a minute, you can't put that name on here. And the next time he reprinted that map, it was off. It was gone. Because that's the name that Egypt had given the land, Tamari. That's where America came from. So now I have Egypt writing about the Americas, but they go further. They don't just talk about we named the Americas. They said where it was. They said our founders, Amenemhat, Osiris, Isis, all of these. Of course, they use those other names, you know, the Asa and the Asat. And so they said they are in the West. And all over the monuments, they talked about Osiris and said he is foremost of the Westerners, which means not in the front of. He was the most worshipped throughout in the West. And not just his dead spirit, they were talking about the man himself being in the West. So now I have those records. And the deeper I got, the clearer it became. And then I started locating the cities all through the Americas. And not North America. Egypt says, man, those, they didn't call them Indians, but they said their cavalry is just so strong. They have bow and arrow cavalry. They are on horseback, and they are so strong, it's just devastating to us to try to take that land. So I tell you what, we're going to cut it right off at that river, and that's why all these pyramids are showing up from Mexico going down south, because those Apaches and Comanches and whatever other tribes were there, black tribes and others, were whooping Egypt something fierce. They did leave the record, though, that Osiris got as far as Washington, D.C. He said, I got to this land, and in this land in the north, I got to the place of the river with the largest, widest mouth. And I immediately ran to the Mississippi. I started looking around trying to see, well, where is he? I'm trying to see where Osiris is. I see that city called Baton Rouge. I know that's talking about, it's got Aton's name in it, A-T-O-N, Baton Rouge. I know there's red. And I'm looking at it. It kind of sounds like it might be an Egypt connection. I'm looking for it, but that was wrong. They said, no, when you get to that place, that's Pataline. That's an island. That's a large island. Doesn't matter, ain't no island here called no Pataline. And then understanding comes in and says, wait a minute, look at the map again. See where the Mississippi River splits, and one goes over toward New Orleans and the other one goes down toward Alexandria. I said, well, yeah. I said, well, you know, when you have a Mississippi River that splits in two, then the land between those two rivers is an island, because on the south side of it is the Gulf of Mexico. All that land is an island. I was like, oh, man, here's Pataline. But he says, but that's not where I went to. He said, that's not the river I'm talking about. He said, this one has a huge mouth. And then I looked further up, and there it was. There's the Potomac and all of those waterways coming together, the Chesapeake, and making this huge mouth to this river before it empties into the Atlantic. And they say, when you get to that place, there's going to be a city designed, laid out in the shape of a parallelogram, which is like a rectangle, square. And dadgummit, if they didn't lay out Washington, D.C. in the exact same configuration that ancient Egypt said that city would be in. And then they stuck an obelisk there. Egypt wrote about that. They just said it was too hard to keep control of that land with that very strong horseback army of bow and arrow shooting warriors. So then we go down toward the south. It's okay, we have the northern extent, let's go south. And we went through Central America, and I saw the cities there. And it will surprise you to know that Egypt actually built this city that we call Troy. Troy is in Central America. If you don't know the history of it before they start calling it Troy, you will never find it probably. But when Egypt wrote about it, they actually called it with those same letters. One word was T-R-W, Troy. But they said, well, we have another name for that city. We call it Kuban, K-U-B-B-A-N. It means the hidden city, because Troy is way up from the water at a time where cities, major cities, were being placed on the waterway, because that's how commerce was being conducted, by ship. Troy was not. Troy was up in the rainforest, way up in the mountains, hidden. And so Egypt called it Cubbin, the hidden city. And I'm going to give you something I've never told anybody other than close associates. You want to find Troy? You go find the city that Egypt says its name is Cubbin. And you'll find this Maya city called C-O-P-A-N, Copan. And there you will have ancient Troy. That's the African city, Troy. So you go further south. You go through Central America. Then you go into South America. I'm looking for Thebes now. I've got Memphis, but they said Thebes is Thebes of the West. That's how they wrote it. Thebes of the West. I want to know where it is. And I found it. And the great thing about it is Thebes of the West is the city that David took. That's Jerusalem. It was built to honor the ancient Egyptian ruler, co-founder, the one that most of your listeners will probably recognize as Heru, that others call Horus. The city was built to honor him, and it was laid out in the shape of the hieroglyphic symbol that is his name. When you look in the ancient hieroglyphs that these Africans that we now call Egyptians left, when they wrote the word, the name Heru, it's the hawk in profile, the entire body with the wings on the side. That gives you the word H-E-R-U, or Heru. And they laid out the city in that design. It's still there right now today. When you fly above and look down, there is that hawk laid out on the ground, the walls, the streets, the temples, everything that they had laid that they have knocked down, but the foundations are still there. It shows you the outline of the name of the city. It was ancient Egypt's or ancient Africa's Heru. Now, they built a temple there to honor Heru. And some of the listeners and readers will know that one of the words that ancient Egypt used for a temple was per, like a rectangle with an opening in it, almost like a house or a temple. And it was per, P-R, or P-E-R. And so when they have that temple there and they're talking about that place where this famous temple of Heru's is, they would say the temple of Heru or Per-Heru. And so now we don't say Per-Heru, we simply say Peru. It's that simple. It's that clear. It's been standing in front of our eyes this entire time. But as long as you let others educate you and tell you what a thing means and you don't test it, you keep teaching the same errors. And that's what was going on. They were getting some knowledge, but they were teaching the errors with the knowledge that they were getting. The Egyptologists knew, but they knew that they were going to hide those Africans. They were going to hide that this was an African civilization because they were trying to justify blacks as being inhuman so that they could make wealth off of them as slaves. And you couldn't say that they were inhuman and uncultivated if you show them with these civilizations. So they distanced them. They divorced the African from the Egyptian histories, or they attempted to. When they came into the Americas in the 1500s, supposedly stumbling upon it with Columbus, you have to understand Columbus had just returned from West Africa. He had the maps. The same ones that had come over and became what we now call Aztecs, and they hated that. That was a derogatory term. It meant that they worshiped the pagan deity Sutek that ancient Egypt writes about. So if you're of something, you are a something. You are of it. So they were Sutecs or Aztecs. They said, no, we're Christians, we're Muslims, and there are others among us who do worship the traditional beliefs. But they were in a mode of trying to show them as being uncultured and uncivilized. So they knew when they came in the 1500s, they knew where they were. They knew this was Egypt. You find this strange letter in Spain where they're having the wars against the blacks who are now running Spain wars, and they didn't lose that until 1492. And when they defeated those Moors, then they said, now we can go and fight the war against the blacks over in the Americas, but not until we whoop the ones that's on our doorstep or we're on their doorstep. So that's the history that's unfolding. They knew that the Holy Lands were over here. The Vatican knew. And they sent it over to destroy these churches and these people so that the Vatican could be the head of the churches by destroying the other 11 that was in the Americas. And Spain had the right to come in and start trying to get the commerce to become rich off of the gold and the other things in the African cities